So welcome to the Russell Ward Annual Lecture for 2020, held as part of New South Wales History Week, organised by the New South Wales History Council, and for the first time ever in the long history of the Russell Ward Annual Lecture as a virtual event. I want to begin today by acknowledging country. I'm in Armidale, on land that was, is, and always will be Aboriginal. This place is part of the country of the Anawan people, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present, and the elders of the Gumbayinga, the Dunghutti, and the Kamilaroi people who share the custodianship of this land. Wherever you are in Australia, you are on unceded Aboriginal land. Some quick housekeeping. Hannah's lecture will be about 40 minutes, and she'll take questions afterwards. And you can ask questions in one of two ways. Either you can click on the Q&A button down the bottom of your screen and type them in there. Or you can virtually raise your hand and we will turn on your microphone so you can speak directly. To raise your hand, click on the participants icon, again down the bottom, and you should have an option to raise hand next to your name. And I'm being assisted today by Catherine Shirley, who's the Executive Officer of the New South Wales History Council, and she's going to be helping me to facilitate the questions. But please be patient with us and the technology. We're all a little bit new to all of this, figuring it out as we go. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Hannah Forsyth is a historian of work, education and capitalism and a senior lecturer in Australian history at the Australian Catholic University, where she teaches modern history, historiography and Australian Indigenous history. She's the author of A History of the Modern Australian University and is currently working towards a new book, tentatively entitled Virtue Capitalism, on the history of professions in Australia and globally. Hannah was an Australian Research Council Discovery Earlier Career Researcher Award, DECRA, Fellow from 2017 to 2019. And her lecture today is entitled Frontiers of the New Cold War, Universities, Expertise and Class Conflict in Contemporary Australia. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you at the University of New England and at the History Council for hosting me for this. It's really a terrific privilege to be here giving the Russell Ward lecture, though a terrible pity not to be there in Armidale, being able to see you and other people, but this offers us some other opportunities. Look, in these strange kind of Zoomy times, I think, and particularly probably in the middle of our ongoing climate catastrophe, it's probably more important than ever that we remember that we stand on the ground made sacred by thousands of years of love and care. And so I too want to acknowledge country. I'm in Katoomba on the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people, and I acknowledge unceded Aboriginal ownership of this really stunningly beautiful country. And thank you all for bringing your land to this lecture. Okay. So it's customary in this lecture to refer sometimes quite extensively to UNE historian Russell Ward. So I want to do that today in two ways. Firstly, by talking about Ward's importance in the history of universities in Australia, and then by considering the contemporary value of the materialist approach to history that Ward used, particularly to reconsider class conflict in the present. So in 1956, when Russell Ward's appointment to the New South Wales University of Technology, which is now the University of New South Wales, UNSW, was blocked by Vice-Chancellor Philip Baxter, it was a personal expression of global Cold War conflicts. After finishing the PhD, that became one of our most famous pieces of history, the Australian legend, Russell Ward, pictured here on the left, applied for his first academic job at the new university in Kensington. His application was successful, but it was vetoed by the Vice-Chancellor, pictured here on the right. Now, despite a fairly recent attempt by certain quadrant authors to drag the Ward case into Australia's history wars, research shows that there's really no doubt that Ward's appointment was vetoed because of his political beliefs. As chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, Philip Baxter had close contacts with ASIO staff, and it seems likely that they advised Baxter of Ward's earlier membership of the Communist Party of Australia. Now, in these days, where we tolerate really increasingly autocratic university management styles, this story seems almost banal, but it sparked a major controversy in Australian universities. An economic historian, Max Hartwell, resigned from the university in protest. Hartwell was no radical, and in fact, he became famous a few years later for his opposition to Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm's interpretations of the Industrial Revolution. So when Hartwell resigned in protest over Ward's failed appointment, it was not because he was on side with the radical nationalist tradition of which Ward was about to become a central figure. Rather, Hartwell was concerned about academic freedom. While he did not necessarily like the things Ward would say, and in fact Ward himself, according to the archives that I looked at, he was determined to defend his right as a scholar to say them. Of course, the Ward case was taken up by the Federal Council of University Staff Associations, which was an early iteration of our current National Tertiary Education Union, who continue to work to defend academic freedom in universities. I've written about the Ward case, and so if you'd like to read more, please go ahead. I wrote an article about it in History Australia in 2014, and I owe some thanks actually to Frank Bongiorno for his support when I was writing it back then. The Ward case took place during the Cold War, and the Union was concerned to prevent the kind of McCarthyism that was then hitting universities in the United States. Today I'm going to talk about a new kind of Cold War, and it's not about China or indeed about any nation state. It's about experts. And this is what you'll be seeing is an early overview of the book I'm trying to write called Virtue Capitalism. So I've been working on this big history of white collar middle class professions, and it feels like forever that I've been doing it, to be honest. These professionals include university academics, though it is striking how similar the history of changes to our work and workplaces are to other professions. Looking at them all together is helping me see larger class-based patterns that have changed over the long 20th century. So I've been using statistics from the Australian census from 1871 to 2006 and the journals and archives of a sample of professions, including nursing, teaching, medicine, law, engineering, accountancy, journalism, and social work. And there's also a cultural history of professions in here using the depiction of professionals in the Australian Women's Weekly and other print media, a little bit of film and television. And in fact, today I'll include a little bit from our classic film, The Castle. So I'm using this project to reconsider class in the 20th century. And my conclusions are starting to suggest that a new kind of class conflict has emerged since the 1970s. And some of the consequences of this are hitting us hard right now. Let's consider these recent events. Early in the coronavirus outbreak, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson boasted that against medical advice in a hospital, he shook hands with everyone. Although soon contracting COVID-19 himself, Johnson's crowing had more extreme parallels elsewhere. In the United States, President Donald Trump rescinded on US commitments to fund and cooperate with the World Health Organization, claiming that their expertise and not his long prevarication was the reason for the tragic and excessive loss of life associated with the outbreak within US borders. In an act of explicit COVID denial, Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro fired his health minister, who was begging the country to take the pandemic seriously, while at the same time in Germany, a COVID-denying political party was formed. Closer to home, the Australian newspaper launched a campaign against ABC medical journalist Dr. Norman Swan, dismayed by Swan's apparent influence during the COVID lockdown on the basis of his expertise. So we know this is familiar to us because the exact same politics underpins skepticism of climate science. Close to all of us working in universities right now is what seems a pernicious attack on university jobs by the current government throughout the coronavirus crisis, and now with this so-called jobs ready package. And look, nobody believes that this is about economic reform, nor indeed about doing anything of value economically or otherwise. Similar politics underpins the free speech movement, which ironically, those who are seeking free speech are also seeking to shut down some of the kinds of inquiry that go on in universities. And alarmingly, we've seen straight out of the President of the United States office this week, a defunding of anything related to critical race theory. It's commonplace for us to describe this as part of the so-called culture wars, but my new research is suggesting that there's something more material that is propelling all of this. And before I go into that, let's return briefly to Russell Ward. Russell Ward, of course, supported a materialist approach to history. Now, I reread The Australian Legend last week, no longer reading it with the critical eye rightly required of the undergraduate study in which I read it for the first time. I was struck by this glorious combination, actually, of economics, statistics, labour and living conditions with poetry, shared meanings and cultural identity. The book has significant race and gender problems that, among other things, have been long acknowledged. But for Ward, social relations were embedded in the material or economic conditions that Australia developed. And moreover, those relations grew from below, from the bottom of society, and often through work. So for Ward, Australia's founding fathers were convicts and casual workers, not politicians, explorers, or entrepreneurs. So this positioned class conflict between this bottom of society and those who profited from it as a key driver of historical change. And this is a tradition I want to explore and extend in this lecture today. Now, before we go any further, I want to clarify what class conflict means in this context. And it's true that it became embodied in Cold War conflicts between the communist and capitalist worlds, but as a driver of historical change, it kind of means something else. And that something was captured in the many versions of this cartoon that were published in the 19th century, showing the difference between capital and labour. Now, I'm going to use these basic explanatory slides that I use for undergraduate students. I'm just going to move myself out of the way so I can see it. And I apologise for this, but remembering these basics is actually crucial to understanding how all this changed over the 20th century. Now, I should also stress that this is not the only way to understand class. For my part, I'm actually a little suspicious of those who hold only one model for understanding class, and sometimes these are held rather more in the manner of religious belief than scholarly inquiry. But as far as I can tell, all the theorists of class, people like Weber or Bourdieu, or in this case Marx, help us with certain aspects of class, and though sometimes these only apply to particular historical epochs or to certain qualities of class formation, class consciousness or identity. So this one helps us to understand class conflict and is grounded in the fundamental quality of capitalism, which is investment for profitable return. They show division between capital, see the top version, where the capitalist invests money in the production of stuff like these shoes for the purposes of creating more money. Labour, on the other hand, is about selling commodity, your own labour, in exchange for money, which you use to buy other commodities like these shoes. Conflict, also, turn the page too soon. Conflict between capital and labour is structured into this. Look at where profit comes from. Very simplified, profit is the difference between what is paid to labour and the materials and the price of the shoes. So capital has an interest in keeping wages low. Labour, of course, has an interest in seeking a higher proportion of the value that they produce by increasing wages, and so class conflict is built into the system. And of course, when capital concedes to wage increase, it's because they also derive profit from the sale of commodities to workers. And so this means that capital extracts value from labour in two ways. Okay. So of course, people who care about class have noticed, and for a long time, that white collar work is a problem in this. White collar professionals usually work under the same structure as labour. Now, in fact, that was not always the case, but we'll talk about it like this because it has been the case for most of the 20th century. So that is we, and I'm going to talk about professionals as we because I am one of these and many of you will be too. We sell our labour for money in order to buy what we need. So we are structured in a similar way in relation to capital as labour. So this partly does that, but it clearly does not make white collar professionals working class. Partly because at the top of the professional class, this can include the CEOs of large companies, it can include accountants or lawyers who sit on the boards of banks, and professionals head up large institutions, including the World Health Organization. Just as importantly, historically, it is evident that white-collar workers have not typically thought of themselves as working class, and this is a doctor, an engineer, and a nurse. Their friends are often other middle-class people. They have also maintained what is usually described as a middle-class lifestyle, which is about their consumption patterns. And achieving this consumption pattern in Australia, my research suggests, has required professionals to earn between 3 and 20 times the basic wage or its equivalent over the 20th century, which means that they are usually financially separate too. So let me take a minute to position this in some scholarship. Political philosopher Nikos Poulantzas argued that the professionals were the new petty bourgeoisie, paralleling the small-scale capitalists of the 19th century. Poulantzas argued that as this class expanded, we would expect some to become capital and the rest working class. And this was among many other things that he said. So this partly made sense because the professions were always steeply hierarchical, so that the top layers did overlap with capital and the bottom sometimes overlapped with the working class. Poulantzas was partly right, because among other things, as the professions grew, those hierarchies became pyramidical with a larger expanding lower levels. But Poulantzas' new petty bourgeoisie theory did not offer space for some important new divisions that emerged as the economies professionalised, which I'll talk about today. Secondly, in the 1970s, US scholars Barbara and John Ehrenreich sought to clarify Poulantzas' theory and argued that a professional managerial class emerged out of the late 19th century progressive era of social and political reform in the United States, which came to dominate political life by the mid-20th century. Now, they too were probably largely right, but they wrote this at just the moment that the alliance between professionals and managers was beginning to disintegrate. And I think that they were compelled to write it at that moment because of that. But we'll come back to that later. Sociologist Anthony Giddens argued that the growth of white-collar professional work marks a transformation to class structure of what he called the advanced societies or late capitalism, which brought a moral quality to class relations at the point where labour and capital overlapped. So this observation informed what became third-way politics in the 1980s and 90s, which sought the kind of bargain between labour and capital that was very big in Australia. And we could think, for example, of our Accord under the Hawke government. So I expect most would probably now think that this conceded too much power to capital and undermined Labor's capacity to use class conflict to influence social and economic change. But I would also say that the analysis itself is also not quite right for also all the ways that it's completely genius as well. In a similar vein, in Britain, social historian Harold Perkin wrote a very big book called The Rise of Professional Society. He argued that in the early 20th century, a professional society infused the economy with a set of professional values. He said that this white-collar workforce undermined traditional British class society and by the late 20th century brought about a new conflict between public and private enterprise. So, of course, the role of the state in capitalism was one of the key debates of the 1980s when Perkin wrote this, where capital was seeking smaller government and so on. So his work was deeply insightful, but like the others, also a bit wrong. And hopefully we'll come back to it a bit later. So you might ask why these books on the middle class in Britain and America are even relevant in Australia. And the answer is that by the late 19th century, a global middle class was quite firmly formed. And in fact, in some ways, we can see this class better from Australia than elsewhere because we're such a late settler colony. So I'm going to describe this in these three periods: the emergence over the late 19th and into the first half of the 20th century, what the French call the Trente Glorieuses in the middle of the 20th century, and the three glorious decades ruled by professionals, and then the processes since the 1970s. As the British and other empires spread throughout the world, a global middle class did too. They were needed to administer empire, survey settler colonies, design roads and bridges, draft and implement laws, treat and nurse illnesses and injuries, teach children, and facilitate communication across regions, particularly in the form of newspapers. So their job in the Australian settler colonies was infused by the transformations in the British middle class in the mid-19th century, which drew on the likes of the impetus towards poor law reform and so on, to combine the kind of economic expansion that characterised settler colonisation with a kind of moral investment in societies with a view to social profit. As white-collar occupations formed professional associations, usually in Britain first and extending across empire, they began to formalise moral norms into professional standards. So values like duty, charity, probity, thrift, hygiene, conscientiousness, and truth became intrinsic to the professions. So this was what Australian political historian Judith Brett defined as the moral middle class. But it went much further than the set of values that she said the middle class tended to hold and which she thinks then became foundational to the Liberal Party of Australia. Instead, I'd argue that these values were built into the work that people actually did. And in so doing, those moral values became intrinsic to the economy. Morality was not just a thing that people declared or believed, they worked it in their jobs. And nor were these morals just virtue signalling. Their moral values were actually central to the efficacy of the work that professionals did. Cleanliness actually made for good nursing. Probity made for good accounting. Truth made for good journalism. And conscientiousness ensured bridges stayed up. So each profession had its own unique set of virtues, though they were interrelated. And together, those kinds of moral professional assemblages formed a moral economic system. And this became materially embedded in the economy because it was performed as real embodied work. They were systematised through institutions, through professional associations, governmental structures and regulatory bodies, but it was the performance as work that they became economic. So thinking back to the fundamental characteristic of capitalism, of investment for profitable return, we can see the ways that the professional class sought some kind of investment in this way, and that this investment was in some form of human capital. So firstly, they invested in themselves through education and healthcare, and this drove the expansion of both. So the professionalisation of the Australian economy was driven particularly by nursing and teaching. And you can see the way the pattern of growth in Australia and the United States were also a settler colony was very similar. The logic of investment in education and healthcare was about a social investment in humans generally. This sense of humans as containers of capitalist value was central to the economy that the professional class envisaged and ultimately ruled. So if this was investment, what sort of profit did they seek? Remembering that this is global, we have to go back to Britain and remember and see that in Britain, it was money. While nursing and teaching drove the growth of the professions in the settler colonies, in the same period in England, it was finance. As empire expanded by the 1870s, the growth of profits from the trade in commodities resulted in a glut of cash in England's financial centre, the City of London. Aristocrats and capitalists who relied on return on investment looked to the colonies for opportunities. Now, the professional class, including lawyers, accountants and journalists, not only dutifully helped British financiers to invest, they also took capital inflows and used them to grow the colonies on the basis of their desired investment in humans. Now, this was not a random desire. The kind of moral challenges that the settler colonies presented made moral investment, often considered to be civilising, a central justification for annexing Indigenous land and for economic expansion. Marilyn Lake's recent book gives a good account of some of that. So as the settler colonies grew, with no real aristocracy to rule them, the professional class's investment in humans became central to both government and commercial enterprise in Australia. Now, this investment was contagious. We know even from the fairly recent past that when some countries invest in human capital, the coercive power of competition says that other countries have to as well, otherwise they will not be able to keep up. So after 1911, the professions grew in Britain too, leading to the rise of the non-financial one, rise of the moral structure that Harold Perkin described as the professional society. Since the professionals invested both money and morality into society and the economy, we would expect them to have extracted profit, and for this profit to be both moral and economic. For the professional class, moral profit gave them moral authority, power in the political sphere, in the economy, and via the performance of their work. So one of the times that this authority was very, very clearly benefited them was during the Melbourne land boom, but this story is a bit long for today. Nevertheless, this moral authority, as we've seen, was inextricable from the efficacy of the work itself, so that professional virtue and professional skill or standards were entirely entangled. So British historian E.P. Thompson famously reminded us that class is a relationship, not a thing. And so we need to see from whom the professional middle class extracted moral and economic value. As we'll see, this moral profit, as the professional class accumulated it, was extracted from those they saw as below them in terms of class, financial position and race. And in fact, the ways that below was both a moral and material state of being tells us just how inextricable the moral was from the economic at this stage in settler colonial history. The professional class did not exactly extract value in the same way from the capitalist class. They did sometimes oppose capital morally. They achieved moral and financial profit generally by allying themselves to the managers of capital and government. In fact, they did so successfully that by the mid-20th century, the transnational professional class established a kind of rule of experts with large institutions, including the World Health Organization, but also many others, which sought stability for global capitalism while continuing moral investment in humans that profited the professional class. It profited them in terms of legitimated moral and expert authority by which they literally ruled the world. This was bigger than the welfare state, which I say because Harold Perkin argues that the best expression of the professional society was the welfare state. And while the welfare state was ruled by professionals, we should note that there were also many instances where professions, particularly in Australia in medicine, resisted inclusion in state sectors, and vice versa. Government often didn't want this either. So, and in fact, I'd argue that the alliance of the professional class with both capital and the state was the precondition to the mid-20th century rule of experts, or what we would call managerial technocracy. This is really based on imposing those later debates backwards onto that period that causes us to think that the relationship to the state is different to that with capital, but it's not. So I think in some ways it's really difficult for us as professionals looking at this period to see what the problem is. And in fact, many histories of the mid-20th century tend to idealise this period, I think in part because they've been written by the class who most benefited from it. So I think we can better see the class power at stake when we consider it from below. I'm going to talk about 3 Australian women who were mothers in the 1960s. Adeline's Sydney life, like others of her class, was influenced by professionals. The family doctor, family accountant, her husband's banking colleagues, and her children's teachers actively bolstered Adeline's class status and reinforced all that she believed about society and family. Contrast this to Beverly in working class Tasmania, for whom professionals meddled and judged. Bev was not white, but could pass, whereas women of colour were not always so lucky. I couldn't get a picture of Millicent, so unfortunately this is not her. But Millicent was an Aboriginal woman in Western Australia. Professionals controlled her life, regulated her income, and restricted her consumption to items deemed adequately virtuous. In 1962, medical professionals forcibly took Millicent's daughter from her, just as professionals had removed Millicent from her own mother 20 years earlier, a common practice producing what we know as the stolen generations. Barbara and John Ehrenreich called these people the professional managerial class, which was an alliance of those who administered capitalism to extract value, including moral value, particularly from the working class and people of colour. This is very well depicted in a moment in this classic Australian film, The Castle, which we watched in History at the Movies recently. Working class dad, Darryl Kerrigan, whose home is being compulsorily acquired by government on behalf of big capital with material interests in expanding the airport, faces a government solicitor who makes noises about, "I don't necessarily agree, but there is nothing I can do." She is interrupted by Darryl, who stops her with the line, "Stop pretending to be on my side." The solicitor, of course, is not necessarily virtue signalling by saying she doesn't agree with the law. There is every reason to believe she genuinely doesn't, and for all we know, she might be working behind the scenes to change it. And in fact, the kind of compassion that requires her to say she doesn't necessarily agree is central to her work, otherwise she's not doing it properly. However, her implicit alliance with the interests of big capital, reflecting the broader alliance between capital and the government who employs her, shows the ways that even when she does not necessarily want to extract value for her own financial benefit and moral authority, her position in the system coerces her to do it anyway. just as the professionals who removed Millicent's daughter from her were not on her side, she is not on Daryl's side. And unless she makes a very different political choice, and I think she should, she can't be. Okay, as I said before, when they defined the professional managerial class, the Ehrenreichs were writing at the exact moment that the professional class developed a crisis. In the 1970s, of course, there was a well-known economic crisis off the back of collapsing currency agreements and oil shocks. But because the moral was not separable from the economic, there was also a moral crisis. In some ways, just as the Bretton Woods Agreement that governed mid-20th century global capitalism came to a kind of natural end in the 1970s, and that's not exactly how it happened, but we don't really have time to go through that very complex story right now, so too did the moral consensus that allowed managerial technocrats to govern the world also come to what felt like its natural end. And we can see the ways that it kind of deserved to end, right? And so this moral crisis profoundly affected the professions. Oops, sorry. Engineers who up until now believed that they had literally built civilization questioned whether they had instead polluted the world and doomed us all to live in concrete boxes. Lawyers began to wonder whether they had been propping up an elite rather than advocating for justice for the oppressed. Medicine queried whether they were an arm of Big Pharma on one hand, or worse, were extracting value for themselves by supporting social structures that kept people sick rather than seeking a society that nourished health. Social workers wondered if they were reinforcing normative family structures and oppressive systems by patching up the poor rather than building a society where there were no poor. Teachers began to wonder whether they were just supporting alienation and industrialised work instead of self-becoming. And in universities, academics too began to acknowledge that they had often produced knowledge that supports race and gender oppressions, and that their teaching of students tended to turn them out as capitalist fodder. And so on. Even accountants began to wonder if they should be building environmental costs and other things into the bottom line. Transformations in professional dress, like those here, were the bodily expression of a desire, especially among younger professionals, to rethink their role for a changing society. An important shift in merit also happened in here, actually. And unfortunately, I haven't taken the time to talk very much about merit in this lecture, but it's really important to the moral economy of the professional class, acting as a kind of currency, like a kind of money. Now, in the 1970s, the presence or absence of merit began to be increasingly indicated by the inclusion or otherwise of women and people of colour, bringing race and gender inclusion into the moral economy that legitimised the professional class. While professionals began to rethink the moral grounds on which their rule was based, an entrepreneurial ideal was also growing. And this was based on the rejection or delegitimation of the moral foundation of profit altogether. Now, the first signs that something was changing for the professions was that the coolest professionals were those who flagrantly broke the rules, so that with some time, being unethical and being entrepreneurial became somehow correlated. And these two characters are Jeffrey Edelston on the left, whose medical waiting room famously had this white ground piano and these crazy 1980s chandeliers. And the examination rooms had mink-covered treatment tables. So Edelston at the time was hailed as a prophet for a new age of medicine that was unconstrained by older norms. He's still around, though he's been stripped of his medical license and a few other problems have happened. Now, a much lower profile case on the right is, this is a really quite touching memoir of this otherwise unknown accountant that tells of the heady days of 1980s accountancy, when the staid old rules that combined morality with professional competence were let go and drinking in the office started at about midday. His memoir, deposited in the State Library of Victoria, was an apology to his grown children for the illegal activity he participated in the name of entrepreneurial accountancy. Now, the transformation that was underway in the 1980s was a separation of the managerial from the professional, and the moral was the substance that was at stake as the two pulled apart. The 1970s had marked an end to the spectacular growth associated with rebuilding capital stocks after 2 world wars and the Great Depression, growth that was governed by managerial technocrats. By the 1980s, when growth was slowing, the managerial class was no longer prepared to allow growth to be constrained by professional morality, nor even the time that it takes to evaluate, to go through processes and things. So the managerial side of the professional managerial class began to pull away. Now, facing existential threats, professionals too began to develop new ethics. These rarely, in fact, threatened their alliance to power, but they did change their relationship to those who managed them. So managers of professionals now found that under new ethical guidelines, they needed to impose considerable new forms of surveillance, auditing and controlling professional work to ensure accountability. And I think teachers and academics can think about the changing role of learning outcomes in all of this that have ended up in such a central place in our accountability. And so in time, this reduced professional autonomy and often broke work processes down into smaller components, producing for an increasingly managed class what labour historians call de-skilling. So this is my big graph of some of the key professions in Australia, and the United States one looks remarkably similar. The changes were also then in response to these kinds of transformations that you can see in the graph in the workforce. So post-1970s globalisation, pushed by changes in currencies worldwide, established a more flexible but less stable economy, which required lots of managers. It did also require lots of professionals. This massive growth of professional work since 1981 is, of course, also what fueled the massive growth in university enrolments since the 1980s. And this is a reminder to, perhaps if you don't have it already, to purchase this excellent book that came out 6 years ago. So to the new managerial elite, the individual moral character of the professionals was at best an old-fashioned affectation, at worst the sanctimonious preaching of the old establishment bleating over their loss of prestige. Managers began to treat professional workers as plug-and-play professionals, able to be manoeuvred in and out of place according to flexible strategies. Professionals, still wedded to the moral foundations of their work, and in fact they have to be because it's what enables them to do it, they found themselves increasingly at odds with those responsible in their workplaces for strategy and resources. The scope of professional work, however, regulating merit through education, administering health and other forms of policy, overseeing the rule of law, and influencing, if not always running, the media, meant that the professional class's moral authority continued to threaten managerial capitalist expectations for quick autocratic rule and financial growth. Managerial control continually tightened so that professionals were now unable to command the kind of autonomy, influence, working conditions, and in some cases pay rates of earlier generations. The managerial and the professional, which in the 1970s could be legitimately clustered together both socially and in terms of their work, not only separated, they actively competed against one another. So the divergence of their material interests and the new alliances that they forged refocused class conflict. By the 21st century, political economic conflict had shifted away from capital versus labour, which is still there, of course, but to managerial capital versus professional technocracy. This is basically what political economy would call an intra-bourgeois conflict, meaning it is not the same kind of conflict as labour versus capital, which at least theoretically was productive in that it led to change. Managerial capitalism versus professional technocracy is not like that. Instead, the world is left in thrall to a conflict between a managerial class and a professional class, and a lot is at stake. Given the centrality of climate change to this division, it may even be that everything is at stake. So the problem is, this new Cold War, this conflict between a managerial and a professional class, is self-perpetuating. The managerial class is unwilling to constrain capital, and they actually rightly see the moral authority asserted by professionals as a form of class-based material interest, which takes away their power to make increasingly autocratic decisions that put capital accumulation before moral goals. The managerial class is coerced into opposing professional moral authority by the imperative to growth. The professional class cannot allow the managerial class to do this. They can't allow them to undermine the expert-based economy for moral reasons, and these are actual moral reasons, not just class-based ones. But this nevertheless ensures that both sides are coerced and the cycle of conflict is perpetuated. So I don't have time to talk about this, but you can see from these images that not only has this become really deeply politicised in recent times, it is also a very gendered division. And it's about race as well, actually. So the changes to merit in the 1970s and to the forms of legitimation governing professional morality led us to this position that has linked managerial opposition to professional class power to a race and gender war. In order to finish up, I would like to return to Russell Ward and to universities. So Russell Ward wrote that the people who did the work, convicts, casual workers, were central to the kind of place that Australia became. While there are some problems with his specifics, the general claim was right. It is by work by the work that we do that the world is made. Let's think for what this means for those of us who work in universities at the moment under such presently embattled, uncertain and truly materially difficult conditions. And before I go on, I just want to acknowledge the really extraordinary, heroic work actually currently being performed by those who have figured out how to teach online overnight. The technicians who have managed to keep this tech going, which seems a miracle in itself. And there's all the student support workers who've been propping up frightened and confused students, the librarians who've been ensuring material is available, and so much more. You people are amazing, and I really believe that together our work can do extraordinary things. And this seems like a good moment to suggest that if you're not a member of our union, please consider joining at the moment so that together we can build the kind of university that we really need, which we really need now. Nevertheless, despite these good things that we do together, we could, and in fact, I think we ought to confess that universities, especially university academics, have been recipients of some unfair moral profit as a result of the historical structure of the professional class. Confessing this sets us on the path to making a different political choice to the professional woman Daryl Kerrigan encountered in the castle. It means refusing the position of, I don't necessarily agree, but I will do it anyway. That position, I hope I've shown, extracted moral value and thus authority and power from Daryl by pretending to be on his side. At the same time, it extracted financial value from her alliance as a government bureaucrat with capital. Of course, if she made a different choice by herself, she'd lose her job. Class power is always collective, and redirecting it will be a collective task. But what if, instead of seeking to accumulate class power by extracting moral authority from Daryl, this woman and those of us who are like her threw in our lot with him, collectively, deliberately and actively conducted our work in Daryl's interest? Now, I know that we have been in the habit of imagining that as we accumulate power, that power will enable us to do more good. But this was a mistake. The intra-bourgeois conflict we are now enthralled to achieves the opposite, entrenching ever-escalating extraction of financial value by an autocratic managerial class on one side, and they evidently don't deserve our support, who are presently escalating this in their battle against those who are increasingly extracting moral value from people of colour and Indigenous people and the working class on the other. The fact that people can see that the professional class is not on their side goes some way towards explaining the growing political support for the forms of managerial capitalism that are starting to dominate many governments. For at least managerial capitalism doesn't pretend. For university academics and other professions, this reveals the new political decisions that we need to make. Being professional and expert is not a set of moral ideas that people should listen to because we say so, but instead is humbly and practically performed in and with our communities, whichever bit of the world and society that might be. This doesn't make the work we do useless by any means. Bridges actually do need to stay up. Knees and hips are wonderfully replaced. Those experiencing domestic violence need genuine assistance, and news, real news, is more important than ever. And so too is our work in universities, teaching students and conducting research. Through this good and important work, professionals really can shape the world. But it needs to be disaggregated from our class power. So what if instead of seeking to prop up an old technocratic rule of experts or seeking alliances with managerial capitalism in ways that accumulate moral and economic power for ourselves, we turned to Russell Ward's dedication of his Australian legend to all Australians who work with their hands? In a different period, but I think seeking a similar kind of outcome, John Maynard Keynes said, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent dentists, that would be splendid. Since Keynes said this in the 1930s, dentists have gone from tradespeople who mostly pulled teeth to highly educated and often wealthy professionals. So we need a different occupation to compare ourselves to. How about this? If professionals, and let's say academic professionals in particular, could get themselves thought of as humble, competent plumbers, that would indeed be splendid. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And I'm sure everyone is applauding merrily in the privacy of their own homes. But fantastic lecture. Brilliant, insightful, and got so much to offer for this moment that we're in at the moment, especially. Just a quick reminder, you can ask a question in one of two ways. You can type them into the Q&A box down the bottom. Please don't use the chat for questions. Use the Q&A. It's just two icons over at the bottom of your screen. Or alternately, you can raise your hand, virtually raise your hand, and we'll turn on your microphone. To do that, you click on the participants button, find yourself, and then select the raise hand icon as an option next to your name. I see we have one question in the Q&A already, so I'll start with that. Someone anonymous says, thanks for the great talk, Hannah. I was really interested in your analysis of the divergence of the professional and managerial classes in the 20th century. The idea of the professional managerial class seems to have been revived recently. For example, it came up a lot in left-wing debate around the Democratic primaries. Why do you think this term has resurfaced, given the fractures that you describe? Does it serve any purpose in analysing contemporary class structure, or should we get rid of it altogether?
Thank you so much for the question. And look, I think that the professional managerial class has become evident to Democrats in the United States in part because of exactly this. They are attacked for the exact things that they sought since the 1970s to change, or that some further to the left thought to change, but that haven't changed. And so I think in some ways this is a good time to be thinking about the professional managerial class, for all that it is considerably less allied to certain forms of managerial capitalism than it used to be, but the continued problems are there, and it's a good time for Democrats and all of us, in fact, to be rethinking what that might mean.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. Naomi Parry has a hand up, so I'm just going to turn on the microphone, Naomi.
I don't have my hand up. It's fine. This is great.
Oh, okay. Thanks anyway.
Fantastic talk, Hannah. Thank you. I really do think that I do think it's something that we really need to think about in terms of collective action. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Cooking dinner for me at the moment.
While we're waiting for questions, I might ask one of my own, Hannah, because I've been reading recently some of Thomas Haskell's work, and he was talking about academic freedom and the history of academic freedom being rested in the notion of academia as a profession, which related to your work. So as I understood him, he was saying something along the lines of that the argument for academic freedom came down to originally the fact that academics were saying only other experts are qualified to judge us. How do you see that playing out in terms of debates around academic freedom now, that kind of argument?
Yeah, I mean, academic freedom does have those two sides. And so our way of regulating our own class power in some ways, in the same way that it's a little bit annoying but understandable that doctors regulate themselves too. So when doctors or alleged to behave in unethical ways, it's only other doctors that are seen to be allowed to judge that, and that happens in several professions. But there are ways that in which that can be a problem, because that means that we can form this kind of cabal with which we hoard forms of power and keep and restrain forms of knowledge. But that being said, I think that academic freedom and possibly professional autonomy in that larger institutional sense probably has more going for it than not, in that there's always things that are trying to seek to constrain what we explore and what we say and how we say them, because the purpose of doing our research is to change things. Otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. And because there's always interests in our communities that seek to avoid change, they will continually try to stop us from doing it. And so we need very, very firm ways of protecting academic freedom in order to ensure that we can pursue the forms of research that make for a better world in all the ways that means.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. So Caitlin Adams has a question here. Hi Hannah, thanks. That was a wonderful talk. What do you think has moved us as a society from working morals to an apparent rise in virtue signaling?
Hi Caitlin, it's nice to see you, and good morning in England. Look, I think that what's going on with the rise in virtue signalling is not actually a rise in virtue signalling. It's a rise in conservatives having a word for what they think that professionals are doing. And in some ways, they're right in that those forms of virtue have always accumulated for unfair, probably, forms of moral profit for the professional class, and the professional class's interest in virtue is a part of its class interests. So, but like, as I said during the talk, it's not actually virtue signalling, because the morality with which we seek to do our work is actually necessary to the work itself. I think what's going on is that conservatives have found a word that describes the class interests that are at stake in the questions of morality in a way that discursively, at least, undermines the moral power.
So we don't have any more questions at the moment. I think everyone's taking it all in, thinking through everything. I'm going to ask another question since I have you, but I'm also very interested in the idea of surveillance capitalism, and I wonder how, if you've worked with that concept at all, how you think that affects this kind of conflict, because it obviously empowers managers in all sorts of ways, potentially to just ignore professionals.
Yeah. Look, I haven't given it nearly as much thought. So I'm about a third of the way through the draft of the book. So the end bits where these things are really going to matter, I'm feeling less on top of the details of it. Though I do feel like you, I think I feel worried about the ways that that kind of very autocratic managerial logic that says, I don't need to take the time it takes to go through a process to ensure that this is done in a morally right way. I can just do it by myself. So I feel worried about the ways that those autocratic processes have found their way into politics, and that the endless forms of surveillance that we've kind of let loose in our own houses offer tools with which to potentially do all sorts of terrible things to us. Our current COVID seems to have created all sorts of opportunities to let go of civil liberties, and some of those have been necessary. So, I feel worried about it too.
Questions now pouring in, of course. So Andrew Stacey asks, thanks for the great sharing, Hannah. I'm pedaling as hard as I can to keep up as a lay listener, but can you explain the rise of the incredibly highly paid CEO in terms of what you've described?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew, and lovely to hear from you. So Of that top level of management changed in the 1980s and has changing and kept changing in public enterprises as well as commercial ones. So rather than thinking of your managerial job like we think of our professional jobs, here is what I am here to do and I must perform this duty. Because of the changes to wanting increased flexibility and strategy and allocations, managers were increasingly attaching parts of their income to bonuses rather than to salaries. And so once they started to do that, then they could start to secure in association with their very increasingly autocratic managerial decision making much more money. And so the very structure of pay for high level managers is utterly different to what it is for all other professionals. And so that, these are the people that make the decisions about resource allocation, and they chose to allocate it to themselves as a class. And that's not, it shouldn't be in any way surprising.
Jane Persian asks, thanks Hannah so much for a great talk. Perhaps a silly question about the respectable working class. Has that disappeared as a concept, do you think?
Thanks, Jane. Nice to hear from you. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. But I expect, and to be honest, we're talking about a question that I haven't really given a great deal of thought to. That I guess the working class itself since the 1970s has changed a lot, and there's been, we might consider a deliberate working towards diminished class consciousness, but that can't be achieved just by saying so. That's partly got to do with the really huge transformations and fragmentation of the workforces. But I think that probably many of the people who are working class, who are working on their own account, so you think about all those people who used to be employed as cleaners but are now individual contractors and kind of run a cleaning business, and there's so many in all of those kinds of professions. But I think that those people think of themselves as a respectable working class, as business owners, and that actually has become a very important component of our political economy.
Okay. Melissa Parsons says, this may be a naive question. I think it's a great question, but are politicians considered a profession?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say that they are certainly, in the past 30 or 40 years, a profession and a professional pathway that is very difficult to pursue if you don't pursue it from the beginning, like all the other professions actually, because professional work comes with enormous rigidities rather than the kind of working flexibility that our market economy idealizes. So yes, I think that professionals are, as the politicians are professionals, mostly. There's the odd ones that have been doing something else, and they're representing other interests, but for the most part they've become a profession, and that probably hasn't done all that much great stuff for.
And what's their ethics? What's their moral basis of their profession? Anyway, I'll move on.
I'm sure that they have it, so I bet that people talk about service and
yeah, sure.
that ought to be true and are essential to actually doing the job.
So Emily O'Gorman asks, hi Hannah, great talk. Could you say a bit more about where the various moral imperatives of the professional class came from? Who had a stake promoting and protecting these?
Whoa, Emily, that's a very, very good question. Okay. I'm trying to think of an example that will help to show it. I mean, teaching has always been a profession that kept moral standards right at the centre of the work. And so straight from those mid-19th century evangelical ideas about literacy and morality, we end up with compulsory public schooling eventually. And so the teachers that are able to mobilise that relationship between their work, the very, very widespread opening of schools, in fact, mostly, well, mostly might be pushing it, but very many individually owned private schools as well, to the teaching of children as a moral act, is really central to the growth of human capital as central to the 20th century economies. But that clearly also benefited teachers as those who had particular forms of moral authority in their town and in their communities, and in order to secure adequate resources to have universal schooling.
Joanne Reid asks, thank you for a great talk, Hannah. I take your point about collective action by the union, but wonder whether you see the role of academic senates as at all powerful in contesting the managerialist growth agenda in universities. This is something that other industries, professions don't really have as a structure of governance.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I have been thinking about this on and off since I wrote my book, and I've been thinking about it this week because there was that article that somebody wrote. Yes, I think it's an important way of approaching it. So there's a few things. One is that I think that our senates and councils have become something like the boards of large corporations, and deliberately so. And so I was, as part of my PhD, I interviewed one of the people who worked very hard on reducing the size of those senates and the councils, because he firmly believed that if they behaved more like corporate boards, then universities would be more flexible and adaptive and be able to become what they needed to be. Now, I disagree that that was the outcome of that, but what that does tell us is that these things can change. So because in some ways the Senate of the University of Sydney has been there for so long that we might think it's an immutable object, but in fact these things can change, and now is a very good time, and I think the union has an important role, probably not just the union but especially in seeking to reshape the university in the form that we think it should become, and I think that really needs to be much more democratic than they currently are, and that includes at those university senate levels.
Great answer. And the Richard's question actually follows up very well. So Richard Scully asks, this paradigm fits very well with what has happened in university governance. Sorry, my microphone's terrible. In the last little while. Do you see this in the classic split between a university council and an academic board? With councils consisting of majority external, non-academic, non-staff, non-student members, supporting an unaccountable university management, which also stacks an academic board and neuters its moral economy by endless compliance matters. How can we break this cycle?
Yes, that's a wonderful description. I mean, I have never sat on either a university council or an academic board, so my understanding of these things is through archives and anecdotes. But yes, I can believe that that is what is going on, and I guess that when I hear things like university leaders who might perhaps be inclined to do something different, feeling coerced by the council that they report to behave against the interests of their own staff and perhaps even their own university at times. And I think what this really needs some reconsideration. Changing it will require very serious work, but I think we should give it a go.
David Gowland asks, hi Hannah, great talk. Do you think the managerial class can take on a moral guidance that was once held by the professionals, or is this solely in the hands of a gender race collective movement?
Look, in some ways I feel like I don't really want to spend my effort trying to figure out what the managerial class should do. But, I mean, there are some, aren't there, that appear to be trying to use their power and financial resources in redirecting capitalism towards, I don't know, something a bit more turquoise. And I guess I think that is better than nothing. Only a little bit, but it's still better than nothing. I think it must be difficult so I think those people must be seeing forms of profitability and using they're using a form of moral authority to be able to seek that in particular segments of the economy. But I imagine that for many, that it would be very difficult to, in industries, you know, let's think about finance and banking, even universities, the big accountancy firms. How would a manager who is leading one of those easily really transform what they were doing when all the others didn't? So the coercive power of competition affects them in ways that mean that it's not just some bad eggs, it's not just some, this is built into what they have to do. It's a shitty job. Let's not do it.
Okay, I think we've got two more questions. I think we've just got time for both of them. So James Vickers asks, Hannah, I'm not sure if I've got this quite clear, but have a go at this. Would you agree that the crucial role of one profession, journalism, having been largely taken over in Australia by the one organisation, the Murdoch media, fragments or diminishes the agency of the other professions as well as workers and is creating a new kind of capitalist dictatorship?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure that I've got the causal streams right, but I think you are right in that what's going on with media does seem to be affecting the other professions too. Let's think about the big four accountancy firms, for example, that where there's barely anything like competition or diversity there to regulate what ought to be ethical behaviour, let alone doing a good job of the important things actually that accountants do. So yeah, I mean, obviously journalism has been in trouble for some time, and that is continuing while the news becomes so important. And I do think that there's something that is making that happen, and exactly what that is that we share between all the professions, I'm not wholly sure. I guess I'm gesturing to managerial capitalism and its autocratic tendencies to point to that. But I think it's a great question, and I will give that some more thought as I proceed.
And finally, we've got Ivana who says, Noam Chomsky's work and his political activism have been influenced by John Dewey's idea of industrial democracy. Chomsky's political activism is partially based on this critique of what he calls political democracy and how our ideological justification for social practices has been created and perpetuated by this new class system. I would like to ask if you considered Chomsky's work in your research.
Not as deeply as I should and will. So thank you for that. I've read some of it, but I haven't been considering yet how that will work in the latter part of the book. So I will do that. I do think that it's really important that we consider what kind of democracy we want going forward. The whole thing looks like it's falling apart. And, you know, so if we want more democratic workplaces, let alone more democratic countries, I think this is collective work that we really need to be doing. And that, you know, this is the right time.
Thanks, Hannah. And I think we'll wrap it up there. So thank you so much. I'm sorry about my microphone. It's breaking down in the middle of this. But thank you so much for a fascinating and timely lecture. Really, really stimulating. Great, great questions, everyone. Thank you, Catherine, for your generous assistance. Really, really helpful. And for all the work you've put into History Week already. So thank you so much, Catherine. And thanks to our audience for attending this evening. If you haven't done so already, please check out other History Week events. You can find the program here. Well, I've just typed the program into the chat, so you can see it there. And you may even want, if you a sucker for punishment, you may even want to join me now at another event I'm organising, which starts at 6:30, in which a panel featuring our own PhD candidate, Molly Northcote, will be debating the value of history degrees in the face of the current proposals to make them twice as expensive. So I hope to see you there, but thank you all very much for coming. And thanks again.
Everyone, and thanks to UNE and to the History Council.